I really wanted to show that tweet.
All right. Hello, everyone. Good evening, everyone. This is Monday, November 14th here at the Ottawa Rebel News headquarters, where we're having some fun prior to starting. I am joined to my right here by Celine Gallas, a fellow Rebel News colleague. That's here with me to co-host the live stream. Celine, how are you doing?
I'm doing very good. Today was very exciting. We're very happy to break this down for you. Yeah,
Definitely.
Lots of breaking ground stuff today.
Yeah, definitely an exciting day. It was so great to follow. We heard from the LRB, the CSIS, LRB, which is Liberal Research Bureau. Anyways, such a great day. Definitely stay tuned for that to see everything that went on today. And I am here to my left with Tom Marazzo. Tom, Freedom Convoy intern / key figure. Tom, how are you doing?
You forgot off-grid. I live off-grid.
Right. Off-grid.
Yes.
How are you doing, Tom?
I'm good.
I'm good.
I'm good.
So just for people that haven't followed us in the past few weeks, if you haven't, make sure to go back and check all of our episodes. Tom, who are you?
Oh boy. You know what? I'm not going to answer that question because I've done about 50 or 60 interviews in the last few months. And I think I answer that. I don't know how many times. And I guess at the end of the day, if your viewers don't know who I am by now, I probably shouldn't be on your show because you've been my opening act for like 3 weeks now.
This is true. Well, this is true.
Let's try to do our best presentation of Tom Marazzo. So that I have to present the people that come on the live stream. So yeah. Tom Marazzo, if you go on LinkedIn, it's written that he's an intern with Freedom Convoy 2022. He was one of the spokesperson of Freedom Convoy. He had some talks with the Ottawa police, with some people, some officials in the police. He was there basically with Tamara Lich, Chris Barber, Danny Bilford, and other key figures of the Freedom Convoy throughout this duration when it was here in Ottawa. Is this accurate?
That's perfect.
Perfect. All right.
Perfect.
And also, as you can see, Tom is dressed pretty well. I'm also dressed well. So if you want to comment down below in the chat, who is dressed better between me and Tom Marazzo? That's the reason why we're both wearing a full suit and a tie. So if you want to make this, if you want to let us know who is dressed better between me and Tom Marazzo, you can always put it down in the chat down below. All right. Before we get to what went on today, a couple of announcements. If you want to help us fund our work here in Ottawa, if you find value in our content, you can go ahead and visit truckercommission.com. And there you can donate as much as you can, $5, $10, as much as you're able to. Second thing, Rebel News Live. You've heard me talk about it a lot in the past few weeks. It is happening this Saturday in Toronto, and on the 25th, well, right when the commission ends. No, not on the 25th, the 26th. So a day after the commission ends in Calgary. Is that right?
I believe it's on the 25th, but it is in Calgary, and you can still go get a ticket to listen to some of your favorite speakers. We're going to have Tamara Lich. We're going to have Derek Fildebrandt, Andrew Lawton. We have huge people from Rebel like Ezra Levant, Sheila Gunn-Reid. Yeah. So you can come meet us, mingle with us, go get a ticket at rebellive.com.
Exactly. So yeah, either 25th or 26th, you can see it at rebelnewslive.com, as Celine just mentioned, rebelnewslive.com if you want to meet all of these great people. All right, let's get back to today. So today, who did we see at the commission?
So we had two testimonies. It was kind of like a panel. They were both giving their testimonies at the same time. So we had Rob Stewart, appointed Deputy Minister for Public Safety in Canada. And then we also have Dominic Rashawn. I'm saying this incorrectly. Anyways, he is the Senior Assistant Deputy Minister for the National Cybersecurity Branch of the Public Safety in Canada. Yeah. So their testimonies were very, very interesting. Again, just like to point out right off the bat, both of them agreed that the Emergencies Act was helpful in some ways, but not necessary, as we've heard. So now that that's out of the way, what we can, here we go. We can throw it to this clip right away then.
Yeah, let's take a look at some of what they had to say.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we can actually take a look. Well, just to begin the live stream, take a look at clip number 1,
Mhm.
where an official from Public Safety Canada testified to the commission that the intel that he had led him to believe that the Freedom Convoy would be a peaceful protest straight from the get-go. So let's take a look at that.
The expectation that I had was that the convoy would park and stay for the weekend and leave on the Sunday.
Okay. Mr. Rochon, is that your expectation?
As far as the Ottawa situation was, yes. And we were also watching to see whether other protests that were bubbling across the country would also, but the expectation was they would all be peaceful and they would last for that weekend. You know, transport obviously had some concerns with regard to various protests happening and how it might affect the flow of traffic, how it might affect supply chain issues from a transport perspective. Canada Border Services Agency, I think, started to ask questions about particular ports of entry. And so from a critical infrastructure perspective, and this is really why GOC was involved, is to make sure that we were mindful that there could be impacts to critical infrastructure. And as a result, we were being watchful.
You know, we heard a lot from these two people throughout the day. I think, you know, as much as we give credit to the testimony, I think we should give as much credit to Brendan Miller and Rob Kittredge. Brendan Miller from Foster LLP, who's representing Freedom Corp, and Rob Kittredge, I don't know how to pronounce it.
Rob Kittredge, yeah.
From the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedom for their excellent cross-examination.
Oh, yeah.
So what was your main takeaway from those two's testimony?
Like in the clip that we just saw?
Well, the clip or just overall, yeah.
It was great. I mean, it confirms what we already knew, but now 100% since this week has started, and you know, we've had so many testimonies that we've seen over the course of, it's been like what, about 3 weeks that this has been
4
going on.
weeks. Yeah.
There you go. 4 weeks. Like that's a lot of people that have testified. So we're moving over closer towards like the very, very end. So for sure, I mean, we can still speculate on it, but I think 100% now this points to that it was the Liberal ministers and it was Justin Trudeau that invoked the Emergencies Act, despite the fact that they had pretty much every single intelligence source and agency in Canada telling them that they should be doing the exact opposite, showing them different ways, negotiation methods, anything that would not actually cause panic, right? Like I think it's pretty simple. I think it was it's common sense, but they chose to do it anyway. So I'd like to know why. You know, that hot potato has now been thrown in that direction. We've gotten 2 more people out of the way. So it's just this process of elimination was so tedious at first, and now I'm looking so forward to hearing the ministers testify.
No, it'll definitely be interesting, and I think, you know, I always find it interesting how the lawyer for Peter Slowly, counsel for Peter Slowly, brought up the fact that as a police officer, as a police service, your first method to handle a protest is negotiation and de-escalation.
Yeah.
And we keep hearing that all levels of government were refusing to meet with the protester, were refusing to literally even negotiate, hear their concerns, hear the concerns of thousands of Canadians who were fed up with the COVID-19 mandates and that travel to Ottawa to make their disagreement known. Tom, what do you think?
So when I watch Brendan's cross-examination for Miller time, of course, that's always the best part of the entire event. But I have to say, maybe, I don't know, because I think Brendan's family was in town this weekend. So we got to see a much better, brighter, pumped up version of Brendan. But I have to say, of all of the cross-examinations that he's done today, I think was a new level of Brendan Miller. The way he had framed his questions, like he started to question the 2 officials on what they believed was suspicion. And there was another legal term that he used, and they were very unclear about what those definitions were. You know, suspicion where you can take actual law enforcement action, and they said they were kind of confused by it. But then as he went on more, he was talking about you know, he was leading them down this path, and you could see that he was setting the trap.
Oh, for sure.
I've noticed that Brendan likes to set these traps, and he's setting these traps. And just when you thought he was going to do it, he's like, you agree with this, you agree with that, you agree with that. And then he said, okay, so you agree that it wasn't, you know, necessary. And then he said, No, I don't agree. It's like you want your cake, but you're not, like what's the saying? You want your cake and eat it too. It was really frustrating to listen to that witness towards the end, because basically what he was saying is like, okay, CSIS didn't want it. We've known that the RCMP didn't want it. Even under Section 12 of the CSIS Act, it didn't fit the parameters for Section 2. So you had nothing.
Yeah.
But then at the end, he says, well, don't you agree that the government never met the threshold? So who were they listening to? And they said, no, cabinet wanted it. So then Brendan says, to your knowledge, is Justin Trudeau trained in law enforcement or intelligence? And he said, well, I don't speak to that. And Brendan said, I can tell you he's not. He was a drama teacher, right?
Well, when you look at the CSIS Act, a threat to the security of Canada means espionage or sabotage. It means foreign influence activities within or relating to Canada that are detrimental to the interests of Canada and are clandestine or deceptive or involve a threat to any person. C, activities within or relating to Canada directed towards or in support of the threat or use of acts of serious violence against persons or property for the purpose of achieving a political, religious, or ideological objective within Canada or a foreign state. And finally, activities directed towards undermining by coverage, unlawful act, or directed towards or intended ultimately to lead to the destruction of property and such. So I don't think that the Freedom Convoy met that threshold. And I think that is what we're seeing through evidence that is brought up by Brendan Miller, that is brought up by counsel for the GCCF, counsel for the Democracy Fund,
Yes.
other pro-freedom counsel. We're not seeing that these thresholds were met.
Well, when we heard very early when the two witnesses got there was the difference between groups in the government that consume intelligence and then the other groups that produce the intelligence. And you have to be careful of who is producing and who is consuming it.
Yeah.
And my impression was that there was a group that was producing intelligence, but the group that was actually consuming it was ignoring it. And I think that's just clearly because they didn't like the answer. They didn't like that the leader of the CSIS, I can't remember his title or his name. I remember reading it. Vigneault, I think is his name.
Yeah.
Basically recommended, we heard this testimony last week and then we got to review it again, that he was saying, if you go ahead and do this, what you're going to end up doing is getting the negative or the opposite reaction of what you want, which is now you're going to inspire an IMVE, an ideologically motivated violent extremism, right? You're going to actually inspire that. And then you're going to possibly make the lone wolf scenario something to start to have to consider.
Yeah.
And so when you heard that recommendation, and then Brendan brought it back to them and said, hey, what about this? And it's like they're agreeing. And then you get to the 1 yard line and they're kind of like, nah, I don't agree.
Yeah,
So you just contradicted everything that you just walked through with Brendan.
Yeah, well, that's what it always is, contradictions. All right, well, thanks for that deep analysis, lawyer Marazzo, King's Counsel, Tom Marazzo. All right, let's take a look at clip number 7, where, well, we've been talking about Miller time, Brendan Miller cross-examining Rob Stewart. Let's take a look at how that went.
Bureau or agency or law enforcement agency told the government, here's the evidence of reasonable and probable grounds or reasonable grounds of a Section 2 CSIS Act threat. And I take it now because it's advised to you that that's required to invoke the Emergencies Act. It's in the documents. You were advised of that.
Yes.
Right. So what agency gave you the evidence and the intelligence that said, hey, we have reasonable grounds of a Section 2 CSIS Act threat? There wasn't one, was there?
So let me explain. Nobody bringing advice to the table other than CSIS is assessing that against that threat. Nobody advising the cabinet. The cabinet is making that decision. And their interpretation of the law is what governs here and the advice they get. And their decision was, evidently, that the threshold was met.
Well, I interpreted that I'm allowed to kill you. That's how I interpret the law. That's really what
Well.
makes something legal or illegal. What did you think of his cross-examination, Brendan Miller?
I think it's painful to watch them squirm. Like that silence was, it was so loud in my ears. It just, it like irks me. But again, that's what you get when Brendan Miller walks up to the stand. You just know, like, that's why it's literally a huge topic on Twitter. Every time it's Miller time, people are like zoned in, honed in, because they know that he's about to drop a huge truth bomb and that something crazy is going to be unveiled. It's nothing that we didn't maybe already, interpret because of what information has come out already. But the silence.
Yeah, no, it's definitely
the
great.
silence.
Last week was calmer.
Yes,
It had a
definitely.
little bit. It was still a super interesting week, and we heard some great testimony and some great evidence was presented. For instance, the Coutts border blockades were dealt with prior to the EA being involved.
And so
We
was
saw
the one
that.
at Windsor.
Yeah, exactly. So, we saw that last week, but it was still a calmer week. But I can say that I have under good authority that this week's going to be a lot more interesting. It's going to be very great to follow. Tom, what did you make of his testimony in this response, basically saying that they didn't receive any intel from any actual authority saying that it should be invoked?
Yeah, and you're right about the that silent moment. I remember that silent moment, and I wasn't looking, and I had to look up, and I'm like, that's weird.
Painful.
Right?
It's
It
like,
was
oh.
painful, that
Yeah.
silence, right? And it's remarkable because they're talking about the intelligence and the law enforcement agencies within the country, but somehow cabinet knew better.
Yeah.
Right. They blatantly disregarded the advice and the access, their ability to be the consumers of that intelligence. But because they didn't like the answer, they went a different route.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to find out when they testify that it's going to be they're going to be hard pressed to justify it.
Well, think about it too. Like you have two deputy ministers that are serving two ministers, right? 100% from the Liberal cabinet who have just said today, 100% that they advised against invoking the Emergency Act. These two people, it was Stewart and Rohit. I cannot pronounce his name. But when you have that and it's so in front of you, it just, I can't wait to see what it's going to be like next week. Like I'm not sure what sort of excuses they're going to have. Again, this has just been a process of elimination, and as I suspected, but now I can confirm that. Like their own deputy ministers were like, hey, we don't have to hit the panic button. We can certainly do these other tactics instead. We have XYZ in our arsenal and our toolbox, et cetera, to use instead of just hitting the Emergencies Act button. And they still chose to go forward with it. So again, I'm not sure what sort of excuses they're going to have.
Yeah, you're
Really, I'm
absolutely
not.
right. It'll be almost impossible for the Liberal cabinet who's testifying next week to actually find a proper justification for the use of the Emergency Act, especially when Brendan Miller starts cross-examining them. And we even saw that that would be great. And we even saw some of it later today too, when some evidence was presented by Rob Kittredge about the LRB, the Liberal Research Bureau. Now I just want to wait. We have Keith Wilson in the background. I want to wait until he comes on to go into that a little bit deeper, because he's actually a King's Counsel, and like Tom, even though
I just look like one.
yeah, exactly. Even though I said that Tom was a King's Counsel earlier, but we saw some great evidence presented today by the GCCF in relation to the LRB. All right, let's look a little bit deeper into Stewart's testimony. Once again, let's take a look at clip number 5, where it's where the the public safety deputy minister was concerned that if invoking DEA could potentially provoke the Freedom Convoy protesters to be even more violent. Well, not even more violent, to actually become violent, because they weren't violent initially. Let's take a look at that. Clip number 5.
Around the pros and cons of using the Emergencies Act. And one of the concerns that I had at the time was of the potential for serious violence. So in fact, one of the reasons to invoke the act was also a concern in terms of what happens when you invoke it. And if it were to lead people to become violent, then that would be, an undesirable outcome. So that was just one of the many considerations we were discussing.
So essentially, it might do more harm than good by inciting rather than calming.
That's right.
Okay.
Wow. It's incredible. Every time I hear it, I'm like, it's that much more real. Like I joke about it, but we literally hear this from every single testimony. It doesn't matter what they say that, even in cross-examination, it doesn't matter what they say to try and make that entire statement seem less than it is. Every single person has agreed that it could have been helpful or was helpful in some way, but absolutely not necessary to invoke a counter-terrorist act. What was it? The War Measures Act is what it was called. The War Measures Acts. These were peaceful protesters that came to protest lawfully, peacefully in Canada's capital. What more? What more can there be? Really, it's incredulous. Really,
It's not even the first time that we hear it, that it could incite violence within the protester. It's not the first time we
they were
keep
warned by
hearing it.
CSIS. They're warned by the RCMP. Like these are huge, like intelligence ops that provided this information even weeks leading up towards the invocation of the Emergencies Act. So I'm not, again, it's just, it's
same,
incredible to me.
Same thing over and over again. It just reaffirms once again that it was not necessary, that it could actually provoke violence when there was no violence at the beginning. You mentioned the War Measures Act. The only times in history where these legislature have been used is during World War I, World War II, the FLQ crisis. Not the Freedom Convoy doesn't even match any of those.
Well, of course not, but they're going to make them out to be similar.
Yeah, it's unbelievable to think that Justin Trudeau actually thought he could equate the Freedom Convoy to these crises. Tom?
Well, if we look at right across the board, all of the different socioeconomic differences amongst the people that attended the convoy. We had doctors, we had lawyers, we had veterinarians, we had carpenters, we had electricians. We had all walks of life from every province. We had the most phenomenal sample of Canadians that all, came to Ottawa for that protest. And so for the general public out there that is against the convoy, it's very neat and tidy. If you can put them all into a box as a certain small percentage or fringe minority sector of our society. But in this case, you can't do that. It was all of Canada that came to Ottawa. It was the truckers that inspired or gave everybody like me, a former military guy, the opportunity to come to Ottawa. So the truckers were the ones that were, they lit the spark, but it was all of Canada that came to Ottawa. And so what you're seeing is this kind of narrative where it's better to put them all into one little container. So it's easier to frame them as being this fringe minority of bad people. But we know this when we hear the testimony that they can't make that argument, right? It just doesn't equate in any way. And so it's really nice to see that they're admitting certain things. But again, this is also a court of public opinion. The public gets to watch this and see the evidence for themselves, hear the testimony, and make a decision about the convoy. But I think it's obviously clear it was never required.
Yeah,
it was never required.
Of course, it was never required, and even he testified to it today. Rob Stewart, when Rob Kilrich asked him, "Do you agree with me that it was helpful but not necessary," as many witnesses had testified prior to today? He said, "Yeah, it was useful." He agreed with Kilrich's statement. We keep seeing it over and over again. It's great. And you talked about the court of public opinion. I agree with you. Even today, we saw the NDP put out a press release saying that they would like to see an independent inquiry into the federal COVID-19 measures that have been taken throughout the pandemic. I think it's a little bit odd to hear that, considering that Jack Mead has been following Trudeau in every single move he made. But I think it still shows that while the NDP continues to support Trudeau, they might see a political opportunity. Yeah, I just wrote that earlier today. I think they might see a political opportunity to go against Trudeau, seeing how the inquiry is going. And now they're asking for an independent inquiry into the federal COVID-19 response by the Liberal government. Very interesting. Tom, your thoughts on that? And afterwards, we'll let you go and we'll bring in Keith Wilson.
Yeah, I think what you're seeing is another example of buyer's remorse. with the NDP sort of
a good way to put it.
associating themselves with Trudeau. But Mr. Singh recently said, no matter what the outcome of this is, he's still going to maintain his relationship with the federal Liberals and keep the coalition going strong. So he's perfectly happy to trample on civil liberties for dental care, okay, for dental work. But I think he's playing both sides of the fence here. Is really what he's doing.
Is.
Obviously,
Right.
like he's hedging his bets is what he's doing.
Of course. Well,
It's
thanks so
shameful.
much. Thanks so much for coming on, Tom. Great suit once again. It's great tie that you wore today, and we'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
I think Keith is going to break the tie.
We'll see. All right. Stay tuned, everyone. We'll go on a short break. When we come back, we'll have Freedom Convoy lawyer Keith Wilson, King's Counsel, join us on the live stream. Stay tuned.
Freedom in the year 2022, for me, folks, it means the return of Rebel Live. Now, Rebel Live is an annual event we used to put on before the man, or was it the COVID Karen, made us shut it down during the pandemic years. It is a freedom fun fest, if you will. All the freedom fighters you've grown to know and love over the years, they're going to be speaking at the Toronto and Calgary events. The Toronto event is on November 19th. That's a Saturday, and it will feature the likes of Dr. Julie Ponesse, Archer Pawlowski, Tamara Leach, and all your favorite rebels, including yours truly. I'll be the MC that day, Sheila Gunn Reid, and of course, the big boss man himself, Ezra Levant. Now, Saturday, November the 26th, we're bringing Rebel Live to Calgary, and those aforementioned speakers will be there, and Sheila will be the MC for that event. You don't want to miss it. It's an all-day freedom fest. I know there are certain would-be conservative leaders that think freedom is overrated. You know, we don't think that way. I don't think you think that way. So if you want to get a ticket, please go to the website. They are going fast. Go to rebelnewslive.com. That's rebelnewslive.com. Get your orders in, and as Billy Red Lions used to say, folks, don't you dare miss it.
Don't you dare miss this one.
All right, we are back. Great ad from our very own David Demenzo in Menzies, and I'm here with someone who doesn't need a reminder to wear a suit when he comes on the live stream. This is Freedom Convoy lawyer Keith Wilson. Keith, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thanks.
Dressed very well, Keith. All right, your general thoughts from today, what we've seen so far, and then we'll move on to the examination of Global Affairs Canada.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's been a repeat of what we've seen over and over again, which is each official that is brought forward is asked what they know about the factual evidentiary circumstances that would justify the invocation of the Emergencies Act, the stripping of Canadians' rights, the allowing the federal government, as the Emergencies Act does, to intrude into provincial jurisdiction. And each witness gives the same answer. There was no justification. They give it with precision, as you've talked about with Tom Marazzo, but they confirmed that there was no national security threat. They agree that the sources with best information that would know if there was a national security threat was the OPP and other police organizations, and they acknowledge that their testimony is that the criteria to invoke the act wasn't there. So it's just becoming clearer and clearer, and it's going to be interesting when the politicians get up because they've really got nowhere to run and nowhere to hide.
Yeah, can you just remind us quickly? I know we talked about it at the beginning of the live stream. I read Section 2 of the CSIS Act. What threshold needs to be met for the Emergencies Act to be justifiably invoked?
Well, there has to be a serious threat to the national security. It has to involve acts of real violence. There has to be a credible plan for some overthrow of the government, an illegal overthrow. Mm-hmm. And there's Section 2 of the CSIS Act that refers to this new term that the government's come up with in recent years of ideologically motivated violent extremist. And the only ideologically motivated violentist extremist that I've met in the last year has been the Trudeau government, and they've demonstrated their violence on Canadians by beating them and trampling them with horses in support of their ideology that the state knows best and Canadians' rights shouldn't be respected. So it cuts both ways.
No, of course. And I think that even today at the commission, the lady who was trampled by RCMP horses during the Freedom Convoy was here today. We saw
That's
her.
right.
Yeah.
So while we were doing the live stream at the beginning, Global Affairs Canada testified in front of the Public Order Emergency Commission, and Brendan Miller even got the chance to cross-examine the two witnesses who were on stand. So I think that you were still at the commission. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. It was still going on while you guys went live. And the senior official with Global Affairs Canada, so this is like, they used to be called Foreign Affairs, right? So they're dealing with embassies and relations with other nation states. And she said some remarkable things, and I was very glad that I wasn't sipping my coffee at the time because I probably would have spit it out. One of the things she said was that they were extremely concerned about the economic impacts of the Windsor and Coutts border blockades. But what she failed to note is that Stats Canada found that even despite the border being temporarily blocked at Windsor, the Ambassador Bridge, all the trucks went to the other bridges. So trade was, in fact, according to Stats Canada, when they studied it some months later, and you can Google this and see it, trade was actually, the crossing trade was up by 16%. So this whole idea, it was purely a model they came up with that if no trucks could cross at all, this is what the impact could be. The fact of the matter is the trucks went to the other two bridges that are there. Similarly, at Coutts, they rerouted to Delmeda and then the other crossing. Yeah. So there was a temporary impact, no greater than a day. But the reason I almost spit out my coffee was every day I get emails from people who've lost their businesses, who've lost their homes, who've lost their families because of the government's overreach with these mandates. Look at the economic costs to the tourism sector alone from the prolonged government travel mandates that prevented foreigners from coming to Quebec to see the beautiful sights, going to Alberta and British Columbia and all those tourism dollars. It was many, many tens of billions of dollars. So they're being a little selective here, right? They're first of all jacking up the numbers about the economic impact, and they're completely willfully blind, I would suggest, to the economic impact that their own travel mandates had. I got to give another example. A lot of people don't understand this. When they brought in the vaccine requirement to travel by air in Canada, which no other G7 country did, we were unique in that respect of overreach. It also required the baggage handlers, the security clearance people, the people who work at Booster Juice and Starbucks, to all be vaccinated as well. So the disruption and the delays, if you traveled at all even recently, you're still feeling the effects where you pull up and you can't get up to the bridgeway because there's no baggage handlers or you're waiting for 2 hours. So the economic impacts of that they're willfully blind to. So it was remarkable that she was trying to vilify freedom protesters for their alleged economic impact, which Stats Canada said wasn't real, and completely ignoring the incredibly dreadful economic impact that this government policy of overreach had on the mandates.
I fully agree. You know, the border communities, the border cities through the pandemic have suffered tremendously because of all of those
Niagara
mandates.
Falls.
Yeah, exactly. You know, we saw some MPs are talking about it in the House of Commons, and I even have a graph right here. I just sent it on Slack. If we can pull that up shortly. Canada had some of the strictest COVID-19 restrictions from all countries. You know, I compare it to Germany, Italy, Croatia, Iceland right here, and Canada from April 1st, 2021 to April 1st, 2022 is above all of the other ones. If we could put it up on the screen, that would be great. But what do you think of this testimony that Keith just talked to us about?
Well, my goodness, I'm sad to not have been able to see that myself or to hear it, but I think I just would have been very, very angered, as I honestly am right now, because it's like a bunch of bullies, literally just picking and choosing which places get to stay open and which ones get to close. And because for less than a day they had some impacts, they're throwing a huge fit and making up all these statistics to try and, again, like you said, vilify the convoy. When again, it was how many local businesses closed, but Walmart was allowed to stay open, but Costco was allowed to stay open. Liquor stores, weed, what are they?
LCBO.
I think they call
Cannabis.
it cannabis.
Cannabis, sorry, cannabis.
We're in Ontario.
Yeah, depots, whatever. I don't smoke, so I'm not I'm not familiar with the terms, but all these places that the government runs or has some sort of hand in were allowed and able to stay open, while small business were impacted. Like you said, people lost their houses, people lost their lives to this, and now they're just throwing a huge fit, and I there's no reason why it can't be justified. And the fact that they have to make up false statistics to try and make this narrative, I mean, it's just, they're digging their own grave here. And the closer we get towards the end of this, the worse it looks on them. It already was bad. It was already very, very, very bad. But what do you think is going to be like the impacts?
Well,
Really?
there's one more that I have to share with you that she said today, because I know you guys were busy
Oh,
here.
no.
The second thing she
You
said
weren't
that
done.
would have caused me to, what's that?
I said you weren't done.
No, I was not
Wow.
done.
Oh, goodness.
But she said that the other concern that Global Affairs or Foreign Affairs Canada had, get ready for this. She was and the government and the Prime Minister were very concerned about how Canadian flags were appearing in Australia and in the United States
Stop, I can't.
and protests
Good
in
grief.
Europe and Central America. Then she said, because it was desecrating the Canadian flag, that these other Freedom protesters were flying the flag of Canada in Europe and in the United States and Australia, because it was being used to promote illegality. And that's why you'll see when you get a chance to see Mr. Miller's cross. But people were flying the Canadian flag in pride of true north, strong and free. We believe in governments following the law, the rule of law, and respecting the charter that puts limits on the government's ability to arbitrarily take away Canadians' fundamental rights and freedoms, such as the right of mobility. So people weren't flying those flags in support in other countries in support of some kind of, criminal enterprise or organized crime or something silly. They were flying that flag in support and being proud of Canadians who had come forward to say to government, you've gone too far, you need to stop, and you need to follow the law. And they use this disinformation thing. There's a perfect example of a senior government official at the highest level under oath engaging in disinformation. They seem to be thinking they have this monopoly on who can characterize the truth. So, and I guess we'll be dealing with more of that next week.
No, of course it's ridiculous. And you mentioned mobility rights, and in Quebec, there were people in high school that would literally run at the end of the day after hanging out with their friends. Even people in university, they would take their bike and they would run back to their home because they knew the curfew was about to arrive at 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. and they're not allowed to be outside after this hour. It's pathetic to think that the government was actually able to do that during the pandemic. Never would I thought that this was something that would happen in our lifetime. And then you mentioned the Canadian flag being flown overseas and people not being proud of that. How ridiculous is that?
Yes.
Aren't you supposed to be proud of your country?
Yes.
Aren't you supposed? Shouldn't the Prime Minister like to see Canadian flags everywhere, because that's value in Canada? In the United States, Americans are proud to see the American flag everywhere. Have we just lost all sense of nationalism?
No, it's because of what the flag stood for.
Yeah.
Because people that were flying that flag stood in solidarity with people in the convoy. That stood in solidarity with putting up a protest against these unjust mandates and vaccine the passports, all the restrictions, everything that they did, it served as a big source of inspiration, and it happened all over the world. That's exactly what inspired the convoys in the U.S. and Australia. They were in Italy, they were in the Netherlands, and there was a mini convoy that came up from Calgary, Alberta, and went up to Edmonton, to the legislature building there, just to show that the Canadians here stood in solidarity with the Dutch farmers that are protesting the insane, I can't say that word, the WEF and their crazy cutbacks on emissions. It's just literally, I mean, you're gonna eat the bugs, Will.
Yeah,
and you're gonna love it.
Yeah,
You're gonna
Klaus
love it
Schwab's
so much.
globalist agenda. All right, we'll go back to Brendan Miller and we'll talk about Rob Kittredge. But right before we go to another Miller clip, I want to show a picture that I was sent earlier today. Rob Primo made that great picture, that great little graphic about Brendan Miller. If you could show that on the screen, yeah, it's Miller times. You know, when Brendan goes like this,
Oh, they're in for it. You just see it, like,
something's happening. You
Yeah.
know, when the shoulder
just
pads go to the
shaking.
side, and when you see him getting ready to continue his cross-examination, you know something's coming in this graphic.
As a
just-
litigator, I can tell you when he does that, he's got you right where he needs
Of
you to be,
course.
and it's not going to matter what you do. You are done. You are coming out of the cage on his terms, and that's it. So,
Oh, you
yeah,
look,
good.
it's
So
like
good.
an anaconda snake.
he
when
just
he's
when he
surrounding
does
you.
this, you're done.
Oh yeah, and you know it. Everyone knows it. All right, Brendan Miller. A little quick honor to you. Let's take a look at clip number 6. Another clip from Miller time. He's got his whole cross examination today was great. Rob Kittredge was nice as well, I think. And
Yes,
I look forward to seeing what comes up for the rest of the week and what comes up next week when he testify a little Transport Minister Omar Al-Jabra when he appears in front of the commission. Let's take a
I'm
look at clip
excited.
number 6.
He stated that at no point did the service, being CSIS, assess the protests in Ottawa or elsewhere, those referred to as the Freedom Convoy and related protests and blockades in January and February 2022, constituted a threat to the security of Canada as defined in Section 2 of the CSIS Act, and that CSIS cannot investigate activities constituting lawful protests. CSIS assessed there was no indication of foreign state interference occurring in the course of the protest. CSIS did not assess that any foreign state supported the protest through funding, that foreign states deployed covert or overt disinformation techniques, or that any foreign state actors attempted to enter into Canada to support the protest. There, Director Venu states that he learned that the EA referenced the threat definitions set out in Section 2 of the CSIS Act once the federal government began to seriously consider invoking the EA between February 10th and 13th. He requested that the service prepare a threat assessment on the risks associated with the invocation of the EA. He felt an obligation to clearly convey the service's position that there did not exist a threat to the security of Canada as defined by the service's legal mandate. The threat assessment prepared by the service was that the invocation of the emergencies legislation risked further inflaming IMV rhetoric and individuals holding accelerationist or anti-government views. You were told that, is that correct?
That is correct.
Well, that basically just goes back to what we were saying earlier, that's the evidence, but he mentioned it multiple times. What a great testimony by Brendan Miller. What did you think of this line?
I think you can only hear something so many times, and that's pretty much it. Like, can you imagine saying it point blank and then just, for the people in the back, like literally screaming, like, do anything except this, do anything except, poke the snake, so to speak. Keith?
Well, and I think you might have touched on this a little bit earlier with your lawyer who was sitting in this chair. I think he works for Law and Order or Suits. I'm not sure,
Something
but
like that.
yeah.
Yeah.
exactly.
he's definitely. Well, I think he was an extra in Suits.
Oh,
Yeah, well,
So
you know my
makes
You can
sense.
say
Yeah.
that he.
I thought he looked familiar.
Yeah, he could say that he played one on television. So
That
he's
is
not a
right.
real lawyer, but he played one on television. But he was pretty accurate. But I'll give it a little bit more King's Counsel precision. It's this: the question in law, when a decision maker invokes these kind of powers, is what information did they have in front of them to justify their decision, and was it reasonable? And all of the experts, as we've talked about, have testified that the trigger thresholds were not met. The evidence wasn't there. So today was the first time we heard what the new narrative is. And from the Deputy Minister of Public Safety, he said that it was for the Prime Minister and his cabinet to adjudicate and make a decision as to whether they thought that the legal test was met, despite all of the experts, all of the intelligence agencies, all of the police forces telling them it wasn't. And then, of course, that opened up for Brendan Miller to say, and what training does the Prime Minister have in law enforcement, beyond
Drama teacher,
beyond playing a police officer in a play in high school or something? And of course, it didn't matter what the answer is because we all know none. So it's not looking good for the government. And it's really good for Canadians that we're getting to see how corrupt the Trudeau government is.
Well, I think that he had as much training as Tom Marazzo had when he played a lawyer, when he played an FBI agent in the series. But it was Designated Survivor. If you guys haven't watched, it's a great series. And also, just go back on Suits. Anyone who watched Suits, basically the whole plot is a lawyer who's never went to law school, who actually becomes a lawyer. And well, I think that could be Tom Marazzo. Do you think he's got the
I hadn't
talent?
thought of that. Yeah.
So just to go back, I'm not sure if we had the clip ready. I just sent it. Brendan Miller, in his first statement at the commission, his opening statement was short. It was 2 minutes long, but it was super concise and precise and brief. And it was a great opening statement, a great testimony, a great statement. Sorry. He said that we will see no evidence whatsoever that the Freedom Convoy met the threshold for Section 2 of the CSIS Act. Let's take a look exactly what Brendan Miller said back then.
Good morning. My name is Brendan Miller of Foster LLP, and I am counsel to Freedom Corp, which is an organization that represents the protesters of which attended Ottawa in January and February of 2022. My colleague, Ms. Bathsheba Vandenberg of Foster LLP, is my co-counsel on this matter, as well as the solicitors of record, both Mr. Keith Wilson, King's Counsel, as well as Ms. Eva Chipiuk, who is counsel to the convoy. With respect to sort of everyone's given an overview of the theory of their case, it is our view that there was no justification whatsoever to invoke the Emergencies Act. The Emergencies Act requires several things. One, it could be invoked due to espionage and sabotage. Are you going to hear any evidence about espionage and sabotage? The answer to that is no. Two, it could be invoked on the basis of clandestine or deceptive foreign influence, or foreign influence that involves a threat to a person. Are you going to hear evidence about that? The answer to that is no. It also could be invoked on the basis of threats or use of acts of serious violence against persons or property. Are you going to hear evidence of violence against persons or property? The answer is no. Lastly, it can also be invoked if there is a group or persons trying to destroy or overthrow by violence the system of government of Canada. Are you going to hear evidence about individuals trying to do that? The answer is no. And the answer is that there was no reasonable and probable grounds to invoke the Emergencies Act, and that the government exceeded their jurisdiction, both constitutionally and legislatively, in doing so. Thank you.
Brendan Miller is also a law instructor at Wilfrid Laurier University. He teaches constitutional law. I think that was just a lecture right here, basically. And everything he said back then so far is true. I wasn't in the room when he said that, but when he's standing in front of all the lawyers who are anti-convoy, who are pro-Emergencies Act, when he's standing in front of Paul Chan, when he's standing in front of the government of Canada, I can't imagine their face when he just hears, when they just hear him blast Justin Trudeau's use of the Emergencies Act and say why it was wrong. And so far, the evidence corroborates the statement.
Each of his statements have so far proven to be true. And as you've pointed out, both of you, each day we're just reminded of it yet again.
Yeah, Celine said it best the first time. It's the same thing. It's the same thing every single day. Every day we just feel like we're repeating ourselves. But it's true. But I think this week you're going to hear us repeat ourselves a little bit less. Because there's going to be a lot more interesting details, a lot more interesting testimony. And by the way, back then his hair looked different. Is it just me or?
Oh no, he's Eva took him for a makeover.
So that's why. That's why. What did you think of this opening statement?
I mean, it's right there. It's literally everything that we've seen. That's why I said, I'm like, we just keep on repeating ourselves. And I really wish that I didn't start every single live stream with, well, this is what we know. And we've been hearing the same thing. It's tiny little pieces of evidence, new information that come in, of course, and it's different people testifying. But all in all, we're here to see if Justin Trudeau and his decision to pull the plug and hit the panic button and invoke the Emergencies Act was justified. And so far, absolutely nobody has said yes. So again, he said that from the beginning. Honestly, I hadn't seen that until now. So if I saw that in the beginning, I would have just been like, well, that's enough. Just put him here. Just have him just show that speech every single day. Just remind everyone what's going to happen when we get to that finish line. That is just a couple weeks away, really.
I think that CSIS is getting a little bit tired of listening to us talking about the same thing every single day. They want more information. They want new information to catch us on. If you're listening, CSIS, I know it's the same thing, but you're going down. Keith, Rob Kittredge, I don't know if you followed his cross-examination of the witnesses earlier this morning. He brought up the LRB, a document that showed that the New Democratic Party was in with the Emergencies Act prior to it being invoked, that they were going to vote in favor of it. Can you tell us a little bit more about that document? I don't know if we have the clip. If we have the clip, it would be great. But can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So it was a briefing document in advance of the vote, setting out what the position of the Conservatives would be on the anticipated vote to invoke the Emergencies Act, what the position of the Liberals and the Bloc and the NDP. And the Conservatives and the Bloc would to be opposed and the NDP to support. And so the question is, how did they know that ahead of the vote? And this Liberal Research Bureau is something I didn't even know existed, but it's a little propaganda branch that's within the Liberal Party, but situated here in Ottawa and seems to have direct access to all bureaucracies and things political. And it seems to be, from what I've been reading in the document disclosures, where some of these highly manipulative plans are developed and concocted and tested. And it's you're going to see a lot more about the Liberal Research Bureau, the LRB in later this week and next week for sure.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking as well. We're going to hear a lot more about those, so definitely stay tuned for that. Just a quick reminder, guys, if you want to chat with us, if you want to tell us something that you want us to read on air, you can always head on to Rumble or Odyssey, and you can send us a paid chat that we will do our best to read on air later. Liberal Research Bureau, just to go back to that a little bit, because we're going to hear about it, so I think it would be great to know exactly what it is. From my understanding, it's not exactly a public servant like Liberal MPs are public servants. It's a corporation associated with the Liberal Party. Am I right or am I wrong?
Yeah, it's not, from what we've been able to determine so far, it's not a formal, it's a branch of the Liberal Party of Canada.
I see.
And so it's clearly a partisan group of workers, political workers within the Liberal Party that manage political strategies and preposition the party for some of its antics.
I see.
Yes.
So we're gonna hear more about it later this week. The Liberal Research Bureau.
Yeah,
that'll definitely be interesting. So,
and who else are we going to hear from this week? Commissioner Lucky.
Tomorrow.
Yes, that's going to be fascinating.
That's going to be very fascinating.
Yes,
I'm excited for that.
One of the somewhat funny things today was when they were getting into a discussion about information versus intelligence, and the two senior government officials today were unable to really make a distinction between intelligence and information. And one of the things that they acknowledged they had an intelligence deficit on was what exactly the protesters in Ottawa wanted.
Right.
And someone whispered in my ear, it might have been Tom Marazzo, Why didn't they just come and meet with the protesters and ask them what they wanted if they realized they had an intelligence deficit for that?
Oh boy.
Anyway,
But, I think we always had the saying, you don't negotiate with terrorists, but they negotiated with Omar Khadr. So I'm not exactly sure if that's actually something they still follow nowadays. And you guys weren't terrorists; they saw you allegedly as domestic terrorists. But there's something that you said: difference between intelligence and information. And two senior officials had trouble making a difference, distinguishing one from
I
the other.
remember
Can you
that,
tell
yeah.
us what's the difference between both?
Well, I don't know that there's a huge difference. I mean, one, they talked about information as it's sort of out there, and intelligence is somehow
Classified.
something that's
yeah.
obtained.
Mhm.
And the more they talked, the more foolish they were sounding. And I really started to think they were talking about a distinction without a difference. Just this language to make them sound more important, and their, CSIS to sound more sophisticated than it is, and things like that. It was, there was no sudden, revelation like, oh, that's why you invoked it through any of it. And the other thing that was a little embarrassing for the government today was when Brendan Miller cross-examined them on their own knowledge of the different thresholds, and they just said, we don't know. So you're the one advising on whether or not a threshold is met, and you don't know what the thresholds are?
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, of course. And CSIS, they're going to be testifying today, not today, sorry, this week. And from what I understand, we've been talking a lot about it in the past week with Eva, even gave us a little rundown about that. But for those that are joining us today for the first time, that are new to this, I believe that Judge Rouleau made a decision to have an ex parte in-camera testimony for some of the CSIS evidence, some of the CSIS testimony, which would mean, from my understanding, that the public and the journalists won't be able to see what is said during the inquiry. Am I right? Can you explain a little
It's
bit
a
more?
little further than that, nor will we as
Rouleau
legal
said?
counsel be allowed to be in the room.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it'll be CSIS in the room with commission counsel and counsel, probably, I would expect, from the government of Canada, telling what the big secret is. And then Rouleau, Justice Rouleau, or Commissioner Rouleau, as he is now, will make a decision after hearing that evidence as to whether or not he believes it is actually secret. In other words, it's of highly sensitive nature. I don't know, maybe they figured out what Tamara Leach's favorite fruit is or something, and they don't want the world to know. I don't know. But I certainly didn't see anything secretive or anything that would need to be kept secret in all of the interactions I had on the ground when I was here for 19 days during the protest, advising the protesters and providing them with legal advice. So it's going to be very interesting. And if it turns out, and I just hope this doesn't happen, but if it turns out that Justice Rouleau says, what I heard in the in-camera session was so profound that it justifies the invoking of the Emergencies Act, but I can't tell you what it is.
Exactly. I know.
We will all be saying the same phrase, whitewash. This will just be a complete whitewash. And I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think Justice Rouleau is going to sell his judicial soul that easily.
But it's good that we're talking about that,
Yeah.
right? It is good to just actually put it out there, I think, because I've thought about that. I was like, are they allowed to just say like, oh, by the way, it's totally justified, makes total sense, but we're never going to tell you why. Then what happens, right? What was this the past 4 weeks for? What was it worth flying people out to come and give testimonies if this entire time CSIS had some sort of crazy revelation, that they just kept hidden behind a veil until the second last week before the very end of this? It's a little scary.
Yeah, and
It
I think in
is.
terms of probabilities, there's not a lot of probabilities that happens.
No, he's
because we've seen
remained
the
very
testimonies.
impartial. Yeah, Rouleau has remained really impartial up until this point, but maybe
It would
devil's
be
advocate.
It would be the opposite of transparency.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Well, Justin Trudeau
Goes
knows a
without
lot
saying.
about that. Big sock wearing, drama teacher, national drama teacher,
Yes,
knows a
sparkly
lot about
socks are so
transparency.
nice. I love his sparkly socks.
All right, before we get going, there's just one last clip that I want to show. Clip number 9. The last clip that we have from today is a clip where Rob Stewart testified that, quote unquote, the protests diminish and that goes beyond useful when he spoke about the invocation of the Emergencies Act. So he basically said that it was more than useful. He's the first one that we actually hear say that. Very interesting, to give the other side of the story. He did admit later that it was useful, but not necessary. But just to actually give him a fair representation, let's take a look at clip number 9.
Numerous witnesses from the OPP and the OPS have testified that the invocation of the act may have been helpful, but it was not necessary to clear the protests. Would you agree with them on that point?
I believe that the invocation of the act provided very useful tools to law enforcement.
Useful tools, but not necessary tools.
Well, I'm not in a position to render an opinion on that. I don't think. I would only observe, as I've observed already, that upon the invocation of the act and the use of those tools, the protests diminished and stopped. And that goes beyond useful.
He still didn't say necessary. I don't think beyond useful means necessary, Keith.
Well, there was a example of a senior government bureaucrat trying to save his job. But let's like peel this back and remove the fog. Everything that they did in Ottawa, they had the ability to do under existing statutes. Everyone who was charged with an offense in Ottawa was charged under the criminal code, not a new law, not the Emergencies Act. The only thing that was unique was the freezing of the bank accounts. I know, because I am legal counsel to many of them who had their bank accounts frozen, I can tell you the precise number of protesters that left Ottawa because their bank accounts were frozen. 0. It didn't cause them to leave. And even if they wanted to leave, most of them could only go as far as the amount of fuel they had in their vehicle because they couldn't get gasoline because their debit cards, their credit cards were all frozen. So there's no evidence that it was even, what was the phrase he used? It was helpful or something?
Beyond useful.
Oh, beyond
Yeah,
useful.
beyond.
There's like Beyond Meat Burger. So the fact of the matter is, so many of the senior police officials, the deputy ministers, the city managers have all testified that they had secured a contract for tow trucks before they had, that's why we've had all this discussion about tow trucks. They had the powers they had an agreement for tow trucks, but in addition to that, because they had invoked the state of emergency in Ontario, that triggered their ability to commandeer tow trucks. Similarly, as was corrected today in the testimony from the lawyer cross-examining the federal government for the government of Alberta, that in fact, under the Alberta Emergency Management Act, similarly allowed them, and that's how they got tow trucks there. So it wasn't tow trucks, it wasn't offenses, and the only thing they can point to is the bank account freezes, and no one left because their bank account was frozen, and even if they wanted to, they couldn't.
Yeah.
So this is all about Prime Minister Trudeau being furious that blue-collar, hardworking, diverse Canadians were calling him out, exposing his un-Canadianness, and looking for the biggest tool, that he had in terms of being able to discipline and show his disapproval to these Canadians seeking to have the charter and the rule of law respected. And that's what this is just absolutely clearly about as each day goes by.
Well, Canadians who were opposing him. That's what it was about.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. We're already past time. I just have one last question for you, Celine, and Keith, you as well. So next week, if we don't take into consideration Justin Trudeau, who are you most excited to see testify in front of the Public Order Emergency Commission? Among, we're going to see David Lametti, Marco Mendicino, Omar Al-Jabra, Bill Blair, Anita Agnat, Chrystia Freeland, some more. So who are you most excited to see?
Chrystia Freeland. Yeah, and I'd say Omar as well, being that he is the Minister of Transportation, and how that was I can't use that word either. How this was very dysfunctional on their end, and we've seen it from all the deputy ministers and absolutely every other person in governance of those areas at Windsor, etc. So yeah, I can't wait to see them just like honestly at a loss for words. Like I really can't imagine like the lengths that they're going to have to go to conjure some sort of excuse. I mean, maybe, you know, we'll have someone be like, well, you know, I have a lot of mental health issues actually. And, you know, I can't actually give you an excuse beyond the fact that I, you know, some people just to get out of something, right? Like, you know, you go to get charged at the stand and you're like, actually, I'm schizophrenic. So, you know, clean the board. I'm fine. Everything's fine. I'm not sure how they're going to retain their positions. I'm not sure how they're going to, in any way, shape, or form, be able to garner the respect or the trust from the Canadian people. Of course, I'm looking forward to it. Yeah.
Chris Shafrulan, for you, what about you, Keith?
Every single one of them being cross-examined by Brendan Miller, and looking forward to the moment he does this. So that's
Miller
what I'm looking for.
Well, I think for myself, my best friend Omar Al-Jabra, the transport genius. Our genius is in charge of our transportation system, which is why our transportation system is so absolutely horrendous. This wizard of transportation.
It's so good. What are you talking
I can't
about?
wait. Yeah, exactly. I can't wait to see this little man testify and being cross-examined by Brendan Miller. All right. Thank you so much for coming on, Keith. We'll definitely see you soon. See you very soon again. And there's a lot of stuff that we didn't talk about today, but we still talk about a lot of things, but there are a lot of things that happen today. So if you enjoyed this live stream, come back tomorrow at the same time, 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. We go through everything that happens during the day, and we'll even go back on some of the things that took place today that I didn't get the chance to touch on. So yeah, if you have any idea, if you have any topics that you want me to touch on, you can always leave it in the comment section, and I'll try to take a look at that. Thank you for your time, Celine. Thank you once again, Keith, and to everyone, have a great evening.
Freedom in the year 2022, for me, folks, it means the return of Rebel Live. Now, Rebel Live is an annual event we used to put on before the man, or was it the COVID Karen, made us shut it down during the pandemic years. It is a freedom fun fest, if you will. All the freedom fighters you've grown to know and love over the years, they're going to be speaking at the Toronto and Calgary events. The Toronto event is on November 19th. That's a Saturday, and it will feature the likes of Dr. Julie Ponesse, Archer Pawlowski, Tamara Leach, and all your favorite rebels, including yours truly. I'll be the MC that day, Sheila Gunn Reid, and of course, the big boss man himself, Ezra Levant. Now Saturday, November the 26th, we're bringing Rebel Live to Calgary, and those aforementioned speakers will be there, and Sheila will be the MC for that event. You don't want to miss it. It's an all-day freedom fest. I know there are certain would-be conservative leaders that think freedom is overrated. You know, we don't think that way. I don't think you think that way. So if you want to get a ticket, please go to the website. They are going fast. Go to rebelnewslive.com. That's rebelnewslive.com. Get your orders in, and as Billy Red Lions used to say, folks, don't you dare miss it.
Don't you dare miss this one.
Numerous witnesses from the OPP and